Hello, and welcome to Digital Health Off the Record, your podcast for the latest clinical technology trends, news, and where we share unfiltered insights on the industry. I'm Farrell Healion, founder and managing director of OptiTrial, and my co-host.
Edwin, I'm Edwin Cohen. I'm a consultant at CM and yeah, equally passionate about digital health technologies as Farrell. And for today's topic, we're going to look at decentralized technologies or DCT. And the term DCT has been used for several years. It had its peak during, I would say, COVID, so which is already 6 years, 7 years ago, which is a long time. But it lasted for just a couple of years. And obviously, with the AI being now on top of mind, DCT has been moved down to the ladder. And we want to but we still believe this is something we need to have in place and need to continue. So, hence, we decided to break down the different type of decentralized technologies for now. But before we dive into some of the success stories and examples, Farrell, um, why would we be looking at DCT?
And I think the importance of having DCT enabled trials, so not necessarily going fully into we're only doing decentralized approaches. So where you have the options available for patients to participate in new ways, because it's an industry-wide challenge. Only about 80% of trials manage to hit their recruitment targets, and that's quite a struggle and takes a lot of time and effort. So anything that can help improve the patient recruitment is obviously a major benefit. And then the other side of that, it's also super important to make sure that we're able to retain those patients that we've worked so hard to get into the trials. And, having some decentralized approaches, so not having everything on site or capturing data while they're in the comfort of their own home, a lot of that can, reduce the travel burden and any of the associated challenges that go with that, finding taking time off work, having to find childcare depending on situations, having to get a caregiver to go with you as well. So it's not just directly tied to that patient. And then there's the other benefits that go with it too. So just because there's access to more data outside of site visits, so you get better insights with the longitudinal data capture elements. And as a result of that, it can significantly shorten your study timelines because the more data you have, the better you're able to prove what's the concept of your study. And that in turn is going to help you reduce your costs because if you can get ahead of situations and you can be proactive in assessing and seeing what gaps you have in your data, taking actions up front, then you don't lose a patient, you don't have to start recruiting again to cover the gaps in that data set. So the cost savings can be massive. And I think the other side of it, tying back to what you mentioned about COVID, where there are patients who are immunocompromised themselves, or they may have a friend or family that is immunocompromised, it gives them an option to avoid having to go into hospitals at the risk of catching some other infections. So it can help them feel more comfortable with participating in their trials too.
Yeah, yeah. I think just to go back to where you started, I think it's really good to distinguish decentralized decentralized trials from decentralized technologies who enable that. And
Hmm.
where I believe, or that's lead my impression, where it started is that the industry was trying to aim to fully decentralize everything and do everything remotely and not to use sites anymore. And that was not perceived very well with a lot of stakeholders in the industry, like sites and patients, and they were all afraid that they would lose any connection and face-to-face contact with sites. And because a lot of type of programs, DCT studies have been set up during that time. I think we recently joined a webinar from Trials at Home that was initially looking at DCT studies and compare that, which was, I think, a really good study. But COVID showed other things at the same time, and that changed a lot. So that was, from a timing perspective, a little bit unfortunate, but still a good study. But the conclusion eventually was that, yeah, you need to look specifically where you can enable this technology to make it in the right balance. So not full remote studies, but more hybrid. And yeah, that drives a different type of discussion for sure. And I think the um, reducing cost was another thing that, as you mentioned, as an important driver. But yeah, I don't think we've done a very good job in really showing what the cost benefits are with this. So maybe that's for another topic how we could do this. But yeah, just to reflect on that.
Yeah, and I totally agree because obviously there's a lot of hard costs associated up front when it comes to
Mm.
implementing DCT enabling technologies, but there's also a lot of hidden costs that don't get seen. So, if you are doing things on paper, who's paying somebody to transcribe that into a system so that you can actually use it in analysis? And as well, one of the really interesting cases is that any delays to study, I think it's like in the millions per day, the cost of that delay. So if you factor that in with, how much data you're missing and everything associated with
Yeah,
that, there's a lot of probably quantifiable, but difficult to get that data together
yeah,
elements when it comes to the cost effectiveness.
yeah, yeah. I think as we are both really sort of passionate about this, this is something that we probably all need to do a better job in and to get that quantified and to yeah, share the added value, not only because it's the right thing to do in some cases, again, increasing patient retention, getting them more involved. I think that's that, yeah, definitely we all aiming for, but that's quantifying that into data is really good. So with COVID sort of still seeing a big sort of milestone that accelerated all of this, can we start concluding already which DCT technology is considered to be a success? And can we, for example, like eCOA or ePro, consider that to be a good DCT technology?
Yeah, definitely, and it's been around for ages and ages at this stage. So it's everybody uses EDC as an example of something that's been a big success in being adopted, but eCOA is right up there with it as well. I've been doing it for nearly 14 years now, and I wasn't even around when it first came out and when people were using Palm Pilots and everything. So it's, been around for over 20 years at this stage. And it's definitely like evolved in terms of what is being used for, and it's yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's 2026. We shouldn't be doing anything on paper anymore because it's not got the right level of data integrity needed. So, one of the key benefits that eCOA has brought is it's brought Alcoa plus principles, and when it comes to that data integrity, to anything related to the patient's voice, and it helps avoid things like parking lot syndrome, where in between visits where the patient's meant to be filling in these pieces of paper and maybe they didn't quite do that, and then they get to the side and they're like, oh crap, I forgot to do all this, let me just fill in all of these while I'm in the parking lot ready to go into my visit, which
Mm,
obviously they're not going to have great recall, so you're going to have biased data, it's not going to be totally
mm,
true, and everything associated
mm,
with it. And as well, there's all the other kinds of benefits that are coming through now. So as the technology is becoming more, let's say, well versed and robust. So now you can access things like digital accessibility so that it can help patients beyond their direct disease burdens so that they're able to, live around anything else that's going on. If they've got, partially sighted, if they've got issues with color blindness and so on, so that you can get the most out of your basically like your phone nowadays. How about yourself, Edwin? You've been working quite a lot on eConsent.
Yes, and yeah, also that is considered to be a decentralized technology, whereas you could argue whether people and sites are going to use it from a remote setting. I do think, and especially during COVID, it accelerated the at least the awareness of e-consent and the early adoption of e-consent. Before that, and I'm not saying it's going to that it exists as long as eCOA, but the principle of e-consent has been out there for a very long time, but it never got to, and I still don't believe it's at the same level as eCOA. So we are, when I say we with eConsent, we are, I would say 15 years behind the adoption. And I'm, yeah, I think it's a shame, if I'm in all honesty. So I think it's a successful tool, but if you look at the implementation and how much time it's being used, I don't think it's particularly successful. So it's we will get into sort of more depth around sort of why and what you need to have in place. But why I still believe in e-consent is because it puts the patient at the center of everything, and you allow them to take things home, have it reviewed with family, friends, whoever are going to be involved in this clinical trial, because it's not only the patient, it's the caregiver for sure who's going to equally be involved. And the technology allows you to provide the information in different ways, including like the animated content, graphical content, although that is not always used. And I understand so also why, but that is the key differentiator for our patients. We've got sufficient evidence and literature out there that confirms that patients like videos and that it increases sort of the recruitment rates and that you can keep a higher engagement. But the industry has not been very successful in getting this to scale. So yes, I definitely think so. Definitely, e-consent is considered a DCT technology. I think it is a successful thing, but not if you look at the overall adoption and implementation, at least.
Yeah, and I think you hit a really key point because basically people are changing in their habits. Like, could you imagine giving somebody from the TikTok generation a stack of 50 pages of consent form compared to having some digital way to digest some of that information? You're going to start impacting your patient recruitment just because you're not keeping up with the, not even standard of care, but standard ways of consuming information
Yeah,
in this information era.
yeah, definitely. And if I something that just popped in my mind is the I've been involved in a couple of sort of global work streams around e-consent and adoption, focus on Europe mainly. And um, we looked at sort of the definition of what e-consent is. And this is where people within the industry already sort of move away from each other. So it's not, some people think it's just an electronic signature. The other one thinks it's the whole set of animated content, these kind of things. And it's a broad scale. And I think that's something we need to overcome. I don't think we will get ever alignment on that particular definition, but yeah, making it just digital with an electronic signature is really the bare minimum of what I consider e-consent. And it doesn't address, as you rightly said, the new generation that wants to have like real life examples. So we need to be more innovative around that. The electronic signature piece is going to be interesting in the upcoming years as some of the regulations will change around signing, especially remote consenting, because what I personally think is interesting is that um, there's all of a sudden a doubt whether the patient who signs this is truly the patient who's signing that document, whereas on site it's always a given, whereas like there's no formal sort of documentation that this patient sort of handed over their ID number, for example, that this is really the patient and those kind of things, or that they bring the paper version home, sign it, and then bring it back to site, and then it's all sudden accepted. And I've seen those cases a lot, actually. But then the question has never been asked. Uh,
And it's probably only going to get worse in terms of the level of trust where, people might use AI to deep fake. But to be honest, well, I don't think people are probably that desperate to join a clinical trial fraudulently. But,
no,
that's just me, maybe.
no, but we've seen cases of fraud from a side perspective. So making up patients just for financial benefit. So from that perspective, I can understand. But we've touched upon eConsent. As said, we will deep dive into these because I think we can talk more than just one podcast on one particular item, actually. Another
Definitely.
decentralized tech.
Yeah, and I think so in the world of connected devices and wearables, like you said, we could spend forever and a day talking about all the different solutions that are out there now. And, every day, week, there's new things that are coming to market as well. I think one of the really interesting tools that came more from the commercial side and then it sort of worked its way into that clinical setting are things like where diabetes management and data tracking has been completely changed through continuous glucose monitoring. And a lot of that,
Yeah,
patients have been the one that have been pushing this ahead of, it being the standard of care or, the standard for trials, because for diabetes patients, they really hate doing the like prick tests because, they're having to constantly bring a whole kit with them and having to do this all the time. And to be honest, the patient advocacy groups in these like disease areas, they're working and trying to find and help each other with these type of things themselves. Like I went to a conference 10 plus years ago, and there was somebody from a diabetes advocacy group, and then he was saying that even back then they were working together. They had like a bunch of engineers and
mhm,
this, that, and the other, and basically they jailbroke the CGM device and they jailbroke their automated insulin pump so that they could talk to each other because basically that's the benefit of having these solutions, right? If you have
yeah,
real time look at your insulin level or your blood glucose and you want to automate getting that
mm,
insulin so you're not having a hypo, and they managed
yeah.
to do that. So then that has become more of an example of where the patient's voice is really being put into practice, which as an industry we need to get on board with following what is important to the patients.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that nowadays we as an industry are much more aware about the interoperability between the different type of systems and that we have listened to it and that the tech more or less is easier to do these kind of things?
um, I think it all depends, really. It is always a challenge getting interoperability built in, but modern day devices and solutions and platforms are typically built with APIs and ways to connect, but some of the more legacy situations, and then
Yeah.
it becomes a whole
Mm,
thing as well because of how to make sure that you're keeping data
mm,
secure, who's hosting, who's accessing,
yeah.
and all the permission-based stuff. So it is a
Yeah.
difficult, complex area, which again we could spend ages to go into detail on. Um, so maybe one more example, which is probably the one that's really enabled that decentralized approach when it comes to connecting the patient and the site is telehealth. So have you seen much? Because I imagine from the example you were saying with eConsent, that's probably a way where they're trying to do that, making sure that the patient is who
Yeah.
they're saying they are.
Yeah, I would say telehealth from an eConsent perspective is one of the features within an eConsent solution, for example. But in general, in even in clinical health, telehealth is more frequently used. I would say this is the most easiest and simplest form and of technology that supports decentralized trials. And I think and again, COVID wasn't the best time for a lot of people, but it brought us a lot of good things. And telehealth or video conference, like how we are now recording even this podcast, is an outcome of that. And before COVID, being virtually on camera and having sort of these type of meetings was not the standard. And now people can't think without having those things in place. So again, the easiest way to utilize this type of technology that is reducing a lot of burden for, again, not only patients, but their caregivers. This is, I think we've both got, without going into detail, personal experience where you need to visit hospitals in between your jobs and sort of personal life. And it's time consuming and it's also having a cost. Maybe that's not the most important thing, but it's time consuming for sure. The logistics, and it's impacting your life. And making just a 15-minute phone call and updating your investigator or your study nurse, that's so meaningful. And from a cost perspective, this doesn't cost a lot. So you can implement this very, very easily, I would say.
Absolutely, because I think it's probably one of the key benefits is how to try and help the trial fit around the patient's life rather than take over the patient's life because the disease and condition they have is already doing that. So
Exactly.
definitely one of the main
Yeah.
key benefits, I would say.
Yeah.
So then looking at the other side of things, so we've looked at what the great successes are. So obviously it takes quite a long time to make something successful in this industry.
Mhm.
What have been some of the key challenges that you get faced with when trying to implement or basically adopt it at this stage?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it high level, and I really would like to deep dive into sort of the challenges per area, but you need to think with a digital mindset first. If you design your trials, you need to allow for flexibility, and trying to keep the patient at the center of your study design and everything. Then I would say it's patient in collaboration with sites actually, because it's and I'm saying that because it shouldn't be about us, like the industry, the sponsors and the vendors. We will be able to collect the data anyway, and we need to find a way to do this in the most effective way. But it's really the combination between sites and patients and how they sort of perform the study in the most and an effective way. Um, and scaling this technology in general. And I will not go into sort of the examples. I think it's really worth looking into that another time. What about yourself? What's are your top two, three challenges?
I think always data privacy and local regulations when you're running global trials, it's everywhere. Some of the key things that come up. So each country has its own rules when it comes to things like e-consent and signature. Some need wet ink on paper and so on and so forth. And then there's some other more practical situations, like when it comes to provisioning devices or bring your own device. So
Hmm.
with every country, they have different standards when it comes to device certification. So trying to find devices that suit each country you're including, And then if you are looking to just drive a bring your own device approach, as is quite common now, a challenge there can be when you're operating in China because they have a very different way. They don't have the app and play stores. You're required to have it on different stores in that situation. So it can be a challenge to push bring your own device in China just from a logistical perspective.
Yeah.
Um, I think the other key thing as well is, how you're getting the most out of the solutions that you're paying for. And I say this from the nicest way possible, but if it's left to your study teams that aren't tech experts, probably not going to get the most out of the solutions. They'll focus on the core, let's say, hard requirements rather than
Mm.
put more focus on how does this fit into broader workflows and different systems, or how do you get most out of the digital data? So how do you maximize
Yeah.
things like getting proactive alerts and notifications where things are going wrong and how to get ahead of that. So I think that's probably the other big area because it has the biggest impact on everyone downstream too.
Yeah. Hey, Farrell, before we close and sort of address the next session that I leave up to you, is it fair to conclude that DCT was a hype during the COVID period, but it was definitely something that was here to stay and it's still here, although it doesn't have that sort of buzz around it anymore. It's sort of a standard thing, but at the same time, we still have some challenges to overcome to have it truly embedded. Is that a fair high level sort of summary of where we are?
Definitely. And yeah, I think it's been around for ages. So, eCOA was doing DCT before it got a PR update and started being cool again. So, these solutions have been around a long time. It's just how to get that traction and get things moving with them. And with DCT as well, it's not just the technology side, but the services on top of it as well, like home nursing and so on.
Yeah,
So
super. So, as mentioned, we will cover the different components in different type of podcast to explain more about the solutions, but also probably for the audience to understand the challenges and definitely considerations, how and what you need to do in order to make it successful. But for the next podcast, we're going to focus on.
yeah, we're gonna look at ICH E6R3. It's been over a year since it initially got released, but it's a nice milestone time point because Health Canada has just put it effective as of yesterday, and the MHRA in the UK are putting the effective date at the end of April. So we'll take a look at some of the key areas and the scope of that and some of the considerations that you need to have in place and taking a look at what does it mean to you?
Super. Sounds really interesting. And wondering if in Canada it was not an April Fool's announcement.
Indeed. So yeah, thanks for joining us today. And yeah, as always, feel free to drop in some comments or DM if you want to reach out about anything. And you have found us wherever you find your podcasts, but keep an eye out on LinkedIn for any future episodes. So
Yes.
yeah, remember to sign up, like, follow, all the above, and let us know any topics you want us to share.
Super. Great. It was nice having this chat again, Farrell. And thanks for everyone for listening. See you
Thank
next
you.
time.
Bye.